And one of the most cliche things we deal with in socialism, we have another ultra leftist versus electoralist debate, except neither side is actually really doing just what is implied by those terms. Now, I am not a word idealist. I'm not a Platonist when it comes to concepts. So I don't believe that just because Lenin used ultra left in a certain way, that that word always means that. But the problem with using words in new ways is concept creep weakens them and creates opportunities for more and more abuse by making it more and more ambiguous what they refer to. Now, I think this is a problem with political language in general, that most political movements often get stalled on a programmatic or policy basis because often they cannot reach power before they reach popularity. Popularity is not necessarily in and of itself, even in a democracy, the same thing as political leverage, which often means that you can have cultural effect before you have political effect, thus expanding the definition of terms related to your movement. And this is not unique to the left or socialism. You see this in MAGA all the time. But the expansion of the categories linked to those concepts means that more and more people can use them. So a dedicated cadre of activists or politicians or partisans often start off building institutions and structures, realizing they need more support to sustain that building, push for cultural reforms that put their issue in the forefront, watch the expansion of the concept, and then after that, and this is not necessarily even bad in and of itself, opportunists and tailists and other kinds of people who want to utilize the newfound cultural popularity of a seeming political milieu will expand it, bringing in more and more people, but also making the original terminology and goals more and more ambiguous. If you have not already achieved programmatic or policy successes when this happens, every term you use becomes open to semantic debate and semantic expansion, which also means they can be used by grifters and other opportunists to confuse or parasite on whatever you originally want to do. The advancement of grifters, bureaucrats, and rent seekers then will make the movement look like it is fake, which will hurt its popularity. This is a life cycle of a political movement that receives popularity and maybe even one or two key political figures before it has really built up the institutions and class basis, etc., to actually start to do its politics. This is very appealing to a lot of sectarians and a lot of reformists and even general progressives who want to pretend to be reformists, because after all, reform implies you are reforming the government as opposed to policy tinkering, which is a completely different thing. But nonetheless, it is common for anyone to critique the entryist strategy of part of the DSA, particularly the DSA's standard stuff around Jacobin and Jacobin Magazine, the half of the Bread and Roses caucus, the Socialist Majority caucus, etc., as being electoralist when they're actually entryist. And they're entryist systemically. They will make arguments, for example, like we need to abolish the Senate, or we need to abolish SCOTUS, or we need to invoke some constitutional crisis, but they literally cannot structurally imagine, even though theoretically they are arguing for a mitigation, if not removal, of property rights in the long run. And if they're not even pretending to be socialist anymore. That we cannot change the two-party system structurally by just saying, but by not doing entryist tactics. Now, I've never said people shouldn't vote or not vote for Democrats on a local level. That's a personal decision, and it's one that you make tactically. but you do not want to be beholden to their institution, funding mechanisms, and party discipline while you're doing it. That makes you a captured agent, and you become kind of used for agitprop. Now, this leads me to debate between Left Voice, a magazine that often has a vaguely Trotsky-esque uh, oppositional stance, and Joe Mayall / Joe Rolt, who is part of what I would consider the progressive adjacent ring of the DSA. And I call them that because I think for all they're complaining about identity politics, beyond that as an electoral populist strategy, there's very little difference between them and a 1980s or 1990s progressive. But let's get into this debate in some detail because it shows you the shifts of meaning, the abuse, and frankly, the structural problems with the arguments from both sides of the ledger here. And this is why people often don't understand me. I am not an anti-electoralist. I do not believe that third party runs for executive office are how you're going to get ahead. But I think if you are a former member of the Democratic Party, you are a captured agent, and your politicians even more so because their structures, funding, and voter base come from larger blocks outside of things like the DSA than within it. Even the largest DSA sectors in the country, which are mostly in Brooklyn, do not even have that many forays into the Bronx, much less into the larger society outside of progressive strongholds. Yes, there are DSA chapters in red states. Some of them are quite strong. They are all in progressive urban areas in the main. This is true in Salt Lake too. There are several cities here in Salt Lake. There are lots of trade union organizations outside of the Salt Lake area. In fact, they may even be stronger in places like Ogden. And yet, it is very hard to establish even working there, much less a chapter. All right, let's get into this. So the article from Left Voice argues that the Democratic Socialists are facing a major strategic crisis rooted in their association with the Democratic Party. And this has come up around many of the problems in both the squad and with individual socialist mayors like Zohran Mamdani. Now, a lot of DSAers like to move the gatepost on people who were endorsed versus people who weren't endorsed but wanted endorsement versus people who were cadres. But the structural incentives for progressive mayors are largely similar. Mamdani has been brilliant at dealing with this, but he also has pretty big systemic flaws, which make the left of the DSA angry and the right of the DSA discount any criticisms from the left of the DSA are outside of it as mere ultra-leftism, often abusing the word, instilling valor from its historical uses in the Comintern, in a way that is frankly deeply dishonest and deeply embarrassing. And I'll get into this. For example, I was arguing with someone about this, and they said that, that the only way to do electoralism in the United States is to enter the Democratic Party. And I'm like, that's not true at the municipal level. Many, in fact, I think even most municipal levels for things like school board, comptroller, etc., are nonpartisan at municipal, in various cities. There, large cities where this tends not to be true, and large cities tend to be progressive strongholds anyway. But in places like, again, Ogden, Make It Right Up, etc., yes, you could have party affiliation, and many people did, and that came with certain benefits and training and whatnot. But it also came with caveats and limit, and you did not need it to run for office and argue. And often it wasn't even stated which party you were in, depending on what election was at hand. Structural limits here are kind of fascinating. And I'm going to get into where I don't believe that people are thinking these structures through very far. But let's get into the actual content of the article. All right. The problem that Left Voice argues that the DSA's current strategy of working within the Democratic Party, often called realignment, the ballot line, or the dirty break, which all have slightly different connotations but roughly mean the same thing, has reached pretty much a dead end, effectively subordinating socialist goals to capitalist imperialist institutions, according to Left Voice. The authors argue that the dirty break strategy, the idea of using Democratic Party's ballot line to build power before eventually forming an independent party, has failed and has no clear pathway to work. The reason why it has no clear pathway to work is because DSA electeds cannot be protected or disciplined by the DSA in any meaningful sense against the larger forays of the Democratic Party at the national and state level. They can be at the municipal level, which is also why treating all these levels of government as the same is a structural mistake, and both sides actually do this. Instead of using the Democrats, according to Left Voice, have co-opted the DSA. Often the DSA's rhetoric has actually become more radical when its actual policy performance and use of democratic platforms like Act Blue have become more common. Furthermore, DSA-backed politicians tend to vote for imperialist policies like military funding because they really don't have a choice. They also tend to be neutral or support strike-breaking legislation, which compromises socialist principles, even if you might ad hoc work out backroom deals that are in line with leadership, but still against the voting membership of the union at hand. Now, the alignment with leadership is often used by later leaders who are willing to work with the Democrats. In fact, that's what they've mostly done going back to the days of John Lewis, and definitely through people like Cesar Chavez, etc. Can be a liability for these unions, and attempts to stand apart from the Democratic Party also tend to be either hijacked by conservative actors, like we often see in the Teamsters, or just suppressed altogether. Institutional subordination is one of the issues that Left Voice launches at the DSA, and I actually think this is a fair accusation. There's a glass ceiling where socialist energy is funneled into electing progressive Democrats who ultimately answer to party leadership and corporate donors rather than any class base. Furthermore, the DSA as an institution is not even their base, even in areas where the DSA helped do the lion's share of organizing for their election, because the DSA is not the majority of any community I know of on the planet, but definitely in the United States. This also leads to there's a lesser evilism that the DSA right often complains about with centrist progressives and centrist liberals, which who are kind of the same thing, but not entirely the same thing, who will support lesser evils to stop the right altogether. Since the right's onslaught is strategically in their advantage, since they're a free agent and such progressives are not, they're a free agent for the right. Progressives are a subset of the Democratic Party. This prevents organizations from building any truly independent political alternative. Now, Left Voice then does the normal Trotskyist thing, arguing that this leaves the working class with a party of its own, making it possible to challenge the systemic roots of exploitation and oppression without saying why building such a third party is a problem in the United States and why most of them had ended up as sects. This is a problem. We'll come back to it. And it's why I don't support, even though I often vote for at national levels, third-party candidates, because I am effectively protest voting. There are no good options for me in a lot of the general national elections, even voting strategically. And that would make sense when you think about the different layers of structure. The central problem identified is a lack of political independence, which I think is fundamentally true. For Left Voice, the Socialist Party must be class independent, meaning it should not be class collaborationist, at least not beyond other oppressed and marginalized classes, such as peasants, which are not really a thing in America, and maybe certain strata of the petite bourgeoisie, and I say that as only maybe. Meaning it should not share a political home with the capitalist class as a whole and with sectors of capital, which you see in the Democratic Party. By sharing the Democratic Party ticket, the DSA blurs the line between class enemies and allies, which is effectively a problem. The proposed solution is an immediate and clean break from the Democratic Party. The left voice asked the DSA to stop endorsing Democratic candidates altogether, to focus on an independent, revolutionary, socialist, working class party, which everybody says, but no one tells you how to actually do in the United States, or actually in most places. Shift focus from electoral triangulation to cross struggle and rank and file, labor organizing, and away also from organizing labor leaders and organizing labor leaders politically, aka as effectively a lobbying bloc. In essence, the article at hand reframes the Democrats' relationship with the DSA is not a temporary tactical necessity, but a structural barrier that prevents the American left from ever achieving a general socialist transformation or revolution. Now, Joe Mail replied, while the left voice argues that the GSA strategy has failed and led to co-option, Joe wrote, aka Joe Mail, a Denver-based union organizer and writer whose blog I follow, says the response to the problem is actually the opposite. Independent or clean break strategies is a recipe for isolation and politically irrelevance. And I actually, on this one point, agree with him, but don't agree with any of his other conclusions. The reason why I say this is because we have to deal with the fact of the structures of the US government. Now, this is not a constitutional structure, and this is where some other arguments by the same electoralists who are doing entryism within the Democratic Party hit a hard wall, because they will advocate for bigger structures while calling that are bigger than changing electoral laws around parties, while saying that it is structurally impossible not to be wedded to the Democrats. And we're going to talk about their misuse of ultra-leftism, because that's the first thing that Joe Mail lobbies at Left Voice. Joe argues that an immediate break from the Democratic Party would be suicidal for the socialist movement. He contends that because the U.S. is a winner-take-all electoral system, unlike the parliamentary system in Europe, third parties are structurally doomed to act as spoilers. The real problem isn't the Democratic Party battle line, but the lack of viable alternative that doesn't inevitably help the far right. The problem is, however, is you are then a captive audience, that even far-right movements would know this, because far-rightists and religious conservatives, etc., often get stuck in the cul-de-sac of their party's national leadership too, because they are effectively a captive audience if they want to have any influence at all. If they are not willing to strategically vote against their own party, they have no way to hold, threaten, or discipline or protect their own membership. Their only thing they can do is opt out of voting, but in doing so, they are still willing to put a Democrat in power. This is actually what the Tea Party threatened to do and somewhat did when it was then co-opted by MAGA and Trumpism, itself a kind of co-option of an earlier Tea Party movement that was largely libertarian, but moved in towards a more post-movement conservative kind of field in response to Barack Obama from 2009 to 2010. This difference and the fine points of this are often lost on people, because now we're 16 years away from that, but it's something to actually look at. Now, Joe says that Left Voice's claim of failure points to tangible gains made by the DSA. He argues that by running as insurgent Democrats, socialists have won more seats in the last 6 years than in the previous 100 years of third-party attempts. That is true-ish, although one needs to add where he gets his numbers from on the SPA in the 1920s and 30s are the Progressive Party of the 19th century, which when adjusted for population were much larger than what the DSA has ever done anywhere. They gained a massive platform to socialize populist ideas like socialized populist ideas, popularized socialist ideas, although I think the socialized populist ideas is actually what I really feel in my heart, like the Green New Deal or Medicare for all. However, they popularize them. Those policies, particularly like Medicare for all, have polled well since the 1990s when phrased a certain way. they haven't done any of them. And in fact, if you look at policy goals, despite all the claimed elections, there's a real sense in which, yeah, all this stuff is more popular, less you've got electeds, you are further away from the policies that you have popularized than you were earlier on. And that was particularly true when the Democratic Party was in power. Now, there's been talk about real institutional power to support strikes and labor organizing. But again, labor union density has declined since the advent of the DSA's return to major electoral politics after 2013, 2014. Now, the canard that is often used by people like Eric Blanc and Joe Mayall and fucking half of the DSA is that the left voice position prioritizes ideological purity over actual power. The same fucking cliche that DNC Democrats use against them. It's a structurally meaningless claim because you don't have actual power to enact your policies, or you would have done it, or you're a liar. Those are the only conclusions that one can make. You either don't have the power, so, or you're a liar. Period. End of discussion. I don't know that or you failed. You know, you don't have the power, so you failed, or you're a liar. If you had the power to enact these policies from this argument, you should have already been able to do some of them. You have not. Not even in cities with progressive mayors have most of these things gone off. Now, Joe Rowe argues that the problem with the break strategy is it retreats into a socialist subculture. But honestly, both things are a socialist subculture. 105,000 people in a country of 330 million is a subculture. One that is already built on and within the progressive democratic milieu. As Ben Studebaker has pointed out over and over again, DSA electeds and labor activists are only in areas that are already strong for the Democratic Party. It is a structural weakness that they don't seem to be able to get out of. Despite the popularity of socialist policies, even amongst some red state and even red city voters. A smaller pluralist group of activists from a political party, Joe Mayall is right, will not have influence over millions and millions of working class people who still vote for Democrats to protect themselves from the GOP. The problem is working class people, by and large, even in some of the elections with the highest numbers of involvement of the electorate in the United States, are only about 55% likely to vote at all. And they vote pretty much based on their regional bias, which will favor progressives because progressives tend to be in highly populated urban areas where so are a lot of party. All right. Then Joe Rowe says we need to redefine the game. Mayall does not necessarily disagree that an independent party is the ultimate goal, but he argues that the problem that left voice time is impatient. He advocates for a party surrogate approach, building independent socialist organizations that have their own fundraising, volunteer bases, and platforms who can do this. The problem is, though, they don't have their own fundraising. Their platforms, everything I've been asked to give money to a candidate in the DSA since I've joined has been through Act Blue, an explicitly Democratic Party platform. All the Democratic Party operatives were endorsed by the major members of Bernie Sanders and the squad. They endorsed Joe Biden prematurely. Continuing to use the Democratic ballot line until the movement is strong enough and the labor movement is sufficiently radicalized to make the split viable without having to hand power to the right. It will never happen as long as the DSA is structurally wedded to progressive Democrats in particular, not just electorally, but also in the regions of the country in which they operate. Joe is right that starting a small sectarian organization that tries to run for national party office will fail and will have very little influence over the working class. But he vastly overstates even the labor penetration of the former labor movement. I mean, of the formal labor movement, much less what the progressives and stuff who are attached to that can do. A strategy of patience would be to use movementism to change the laws and have multiple kinds of socialist organizations that were not wedded to any party, but operated off of programmatic interests and could strategically operate with other electeds how they saw fit based on that program. Any denouncement of anyone who criticizes entryism as a failure to do that as an ultra-leftist is historically illiterate. And I'll get into that. Why? Now, the use of ultra-left by Joe Mayall in his response to Left Voice is a modern application of polemic that, of course, traces back to Lenin's 1920 pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. It is an insult. The opponent is being unrealistically radical to the point of self-sabotage. But what Lenin meant by that, and what some of the responses I got from this are irrelevant. Lenin was arguing against European communists like those in Germany and the UK who refused to participate in bourgeois parliaments, particularly around the KPD. Excuse me, I'm going back between English and German. The KAPD are some elements of the Spartacus burn. Are reactionary trade unions, such as guild unions and stuff, because they believe those institutions were obsolete after the Russian Revolution. Joe is arguing that the left voice call for the DSA to immediately read the Democratic Party ballot line is a problem. The difference, ultra-left is a mistake for refusing to enter Parliament to destroy its illusions from within. There was no call to do policy-based electoralism by Lenin, and there was definitely no call to enter bourgeois parties, even in places where socialism was structurally blocked. Socialist parties were illegal in many places where this was aimed. They were criminalized. They had to operate underground. If the argument is that we should use the Democratic Party to make policy wins and build a base, we also have to control that policy, which we don't do from within the Democratic Party. We have to do so at multiple levels and then build the base from that. The problem is you need the base to have done the first thing in the first place. How are you going to use the Democratic Party to win elections for your progressive candidates without a base for which they can operate and win those policies over? The logic is almost perfectly circular. This is a focus on practical utility of the ballot line and also treats it as a principal point. Whereas Lenin's argument was the platform for the ballot line was a platform for some reforms and for revolutionary agitation. Lenin also defined ultra-leftism as a failure to meet the working class where they actually are. If the masses have illusions in parliament or reformist unions, communists must go there and win them over. To stay out of it is childish because it isolates any kind of vanguard movement, which we can have our own critiques of that, from the class as a whole. But Joe and those like him are using the term to describe a preference for ideological purity over political efficacy without saying what the political efficacy would really be for, since the reforms in popularity, no matter how popular they are, and no matter how many of these small level electeds they are, have not been enough to get these reforms done and through for the simpler circular reason that I said earlier. You would already have to have a mass base to do that. Otherwise, the party that controls the purse and the access will use it and set it up as they see fit. You might even get these progressive policy things in name, but then it will be administrated by block grants or whatever the Democrats decide to fucking do with it. You can see this in the Medicare for All debates in 2019 in particular, because 6 years ago, almost every Democrat was running to steal the valor of the DSA's use of that program, but we define what it meant. Now, it is true that millions of working class voters are in the Democratic Party, but millions of working class voters are in the Republican Party, and I'm not telling you to tail them. Lenin actually advocated for a version of the break. He wanted communists to form an independent parties and to use tactical compromises like supporting the Labor Party as a rope supports a hangman to expose the problems of reformists. That can't be done easily in the United States. Joe and people like him are wrong about that. The issue is, however, other things they say they want to do or be just as hard. And both strategies, the immediate break and call for the formation of a small sectarian party that was somehow going to revolutionary affect the working class because they believe in socialism hard enough, or a insurgent institution of 105 to 300,000 people who work as effectively a caucus block under a nonprofit political advocacy organization, which can't even legally act as a party or even a party surrogate, really, because of the limits on spending that they have under that structure, can't possibly do. And I think DSAers need to be more fucking honest about what the structures of our institutions are, not just in our bylaws and whatever we agree at the convention, but what we have legally agreed to by being a 401(c) or D or whatever we are. Joe is using Lenin's terminology to find a strategy that Lenin would have likely viewed as right opportunism, and thus moving the entire spectrum of debate to the right. Now, I'm not saying Joe is a right winger. I'm saying that he's basically arguing that entryism is the only way to go. And many people have pointed out that, like, the United States is a parliamentary system. No, but you know what is also true? There is no national level legal basis for the parties being as grounded as they are. They are not constitutional entities. They are private organizations that are often protected at state and local law, where making more strategic alliances with Democrats might make sense if you are not strategically part of their party, which is something labor unions and stuff used to utilize until they were effectively captured for doing so. And look what they got for it. Everyone calls everyone else a deviationist in Marxism. It's the most common cliched thing in the world. And every answer to every opportunist structure, opportunist problem is to call for the creation of a party without dealing with the structural limits of creating one. However, the answer to that is not just let's do what 1970s, 80s, and 90s progressives did, but under a socialist banner and fail in the same way. The answer to that is look at the structural integrity and go through it. Now, it is true, Joe says that they don't actually encourage everyone to just run as Democrats. The problem is, they, even in places where they don't, they generally do caucus with them. Now, I'm not going to tell people not to join the DSA because obviously I'm a member, although I am a very frustrated one. Locally, we have devoted a lot of our resources to a state senate campaign in a district that I'm not even in. I have supported them to some degree with money, but I don't canvass for Democrats not out of political and personal purity, but because I've done it before and I found it an incredibly ineffective experience. Now people go, oh, you need to go where people all are, and I'm a union organizer and a teacher. I know where the people are. I also know the likelihood of such things working. I support our candidate. I do, actually. But it doesn't matter if I support them because they're a state senate candidate in a district that I can't vote for. Now, there's been a lot of structural uses to get people to follow progressives to certain areas, and to use controversies to get progressives on the national stage, from John Fetterman to Glenn Prattner. I'm not here to say anything about what Plattner would be if he got elected. I don't know. But I will say that if these progressive things go anyway like they did with Fetterman priorly, where a lot of progressive and Bernie Pac resources went into, this has become a problem. And that structurally has happened before Fetterman. Kristen Sinema was early on in her career associated with the Green Party and the Occupy movement. Many such deviationists exist. You need programmatic unity as a principle before you talk about whether or not we should be doing even these strategic issues. It is absurd to me to call for things like the abolition of the Senate and the abolition of the Supreme Court, or even to advocate for the abolition of property and change of the fundamental tax code at a constitutional level off of executive elections or municipal socialism. And it is structurally absurd to say that you can't change a two-party system in America because it is a winner-take-all system in most states, not even in all states. It is a winner-take-all system in the Electoral College, but even that is its own thing that would need to be reformed. The number of reforms you need to do many of the things that socialists say they want to do far exceeds the number of reforms you need to change the state laws in 50 states if your grouping and political milieu was not dependent and downstream of progressive Democrats. And whether you like it or not, or whether you want to believe it or not, and I'm a member of a formal trade union, well, actually, I'm a member of a teachers union, of a public employees union. I'm a rep for that union. But even with all that, I know that we have a lot to do to turn all the workers' agitation and the worker movement into the United States into a more formally organized workers' movement that can be represented by labor. We have failed to do that during the years of DSA ascendancy. And yet, what is being promised is based off of the assumption that that has already happened. It has not. We are not close enough to do a clean or a dirty break because we don't even know what it would be for, since we have expanded the definition of socialism to any public good whatsoever and not workers' control over the means of production and their common future. This is not about ideological purity. This is about one structural critique hitting another structural critique because both of them are selective, and so selective as to be effectively self-delusional. Protect your peace.